Um, so I wanted to talk today about the quality of wisdom or discernment, which is obviously very present within the Buddhist teachings, so it's often said there are the wings of wisdom and compassion. Wisdom is one of the 10 parami, which is said to be one of the qualities that the Buddha cultivated over lifetimes that helped him to awaken in the lifetime that he did. And I think it's a really interesting quality to contemplate, not just kind of theoretically, but in terms of how do we actually find this in our being and how do we bring it through into this world that we're part of. And I think Buddhism has some really interesting aspects to bring to this, actually. So Ajahn Sucitto talks about wisdom as the discriminative faculty that operates through discernment or clarity, and that this is it's experiential rather than through, it's not like learning, it's not like rote learning. So it does say in the text that, we can go through the different stages of, like, we hear teachings, so we're learning them in that sense, and, like, I listen to teachings, I contemplate them, so we listen, we're studying, and then we're practicing with them. And I think this is really interesting to really recognize that we need to practice with them. It's not like, okay, we listen, we hear about it and then it just kind of happens. It's like we actually need to be practicing and contemplating, how are we taking these teachings in? How does this come through my being? So the element of authenticity there too, and our questions are important parts of that. And then there's the realization, so it's like coming through our being. And I don't know if this feels like this for other people, but for me it feels like there's often like spirals of realization, of like listening, taking in, understanding, then something else comes up, we listen again, we understand differently, we take it in again. So it's an evolutive process for me, and I think that's also important, that it's not like a fixed wisdom that we're getting. It's like it's a learning of how we process things. And in the suttas, it says that wisdom and consciousness are conjoined. So wherever there is consciousness, wisdom can be there. And it can be there in the sense of just simple discernment, say, of light and dark, of pain or pleasure, etc. So we can be differentiating those things. But in Buddhism, what I think particularly Buddhism has to offer in this regard is that it's not just simple discernment of light and dark. It's that there's this inherent questioning. Am I fostering greed? Am I fostering hatred? Am I fostering delusion? This is at the core of the discernment faculty of wisdom. So in the Anguttara Nikaya, there's this question, how is a mendicant's mind consolidated with wisdom? And it says, the mind is well consolidated with wisdom when we know my mind is without greed, is without hatred, is without aversion, and it's without the conditions that would add to that. So that sounds like a big leap, but actually I feel it's like really asking us to look in our present moment daily responses in this way. It's almost like a way that we incline the mind, and it's to be developed. So it's like a muscle that we're developing, and that can then come through in our actions of body, speech, and mind. And it's really important. So when the Buddha talks about like the 12 links of dependent origination and how basically the cycle of suffering comes into being, ignorance is the first link. And so wisdom is asking us to look clearly. And the very first thing for me in this looking clearly, for me, is related to those 5 subjects for frequent recollection. So the Buddha's asking us to look clearly at our human condition. So we are vulnerable beings. In being born in a kind of, in a body, in a dependent body, We are vulnerable beings. We're vulnerable to old age, to sickness, to death, to loss. And that's a very powerful chant that we did at the beginning that asks us to lean into that reality. And instead of just reacting to it, instead of disconnecting and then doing all of the crazy things that we're doing to try and stop it, it's like, how do we want to respond? And in here, there's also a fundamental recognition of our interconnectedness. So I'm not the only one to age, to suffer loss. So there's a reaching out that we're part of a vulnerable world, actually. And how are we taking care of this vulnerable world that we're part of, that we're nourished by and that we're part of? And the very last part of that chant is pointing to how our actions of body, speech, and mind. It's like, this is where we're going to be standing. This is, that how we're responding in body, speech, and mind is the ground that we're going to be coming from, actually. And we need to have wisdom here. So there's a level at which this capacity of discernment, the very first thing for me is asking us to be truthful about our human condition. And that opens already up a lot, because it opens up both our sense of interdependence, how we actually depend on each other, that field of compassion, and also the capacity we have for awake awareness, discernment, which we often don't notice when we're not being asked to look at it. So we have these gifts, actually, of the capacity to feel our interdependence and to know that we have awakeness. So that's already pretty good. And then Ajahn Chito comes up with this sense of, like, with that awakeness, he points out how wisdom gives us this innate discernment to be able to sense that which is for our own welfare, the welfare of others, or the welfare of both. So he uses the image of a raccoon, which is really cute, and it's also quite profound, actually. So, and for anyone who knows me, you know I like animals. So, yeah, so he says, wisdom is an innate faculty and is not just theoretical. It's like the discernment of a raccoon, whose wise paws can distinguish between a rock and a clam in a stream. In a similar way, our minds have an awareness that is able to receive and evaluate the states they go through. This mental awareness, chitta, already has enough wisdom to recognize and resonate with qualities like kindness, generosity, truthfulness, and integrity. We know what goodness feels like when it occurs. It is something that strikes us. Then if we reflect and consider the message that our clarity rather than our confusion gives us, we steer towards that goodness, both because it makes us feel good and because it brings balance to our world. Reflective awareness has to be developed through encouragement and practice, because the default is to let assumptions, beliefs, passions, and worries lead the mind, because they speak the loudest. So this is really important, because it's speaking to the different levels at which our being operates. That we, of course, we have like assumptions, beliefs, worries, and we also have the level at which in the world at the moment there's a lot of delusion. There's a lot of ways in which we're both bombarded by information in the media, and the media is also really silent around certain things. So there's a lot of silence now, and has been historically, around what's happening in Gaza. The media's bombarding us with like a lot of things, but not necessarily also portraying what people are doing to support good things to happen. They're also very selective in which deaths matter, which don't. This is all stuff that we, some of us are more familiar with, some of us need to be turning our attention there. And so there's all of that level at which we're not, we have to be very discerning, both in what information we take in, how we take that in, what we choose to foster, and where we choose to give our attention. These are all things that wisdom can help us to discern with. And so wisdom is, at its heart, very simple and beautiful in this way, like the raccoon feeling with its paws. Is this leading towards the end of suffering or not, you know? And yet it's very powerful and onward leading. So this word in the texts for the Dharma, which is opanayiko, it's leading onwards. This is not a place that we get to, it's a way of relating. And I think it really brings us to going deeper and deeper into our being and into our shared being, into our collective being, actually. So one aspect of wisdom for me is the capacity to look into our interdependence, to look into our elemental nature, our shared humanity, our shared sentience with the other beings in this world and the planet that we're part of. And as we get more in touch with that, it feels like a deeper care and concern comes with that, and that wisdom which does not want to foster harm to myself or to other beings, it's like it becomes active in a collective sense as well. So there's a care and there's an accountability there, actually. So Joanna Macy, she talks about these two very simple qualities that we can start to contact with our discernment, that we get in touch with our interdependence, we get in touch with our boundless heart, our capacity for awakeness, and we start to be able to look beyond our own interests into what is for our collective well-being, our collective liberation, and what she calls our conscious participation in life. And she talks about a power with that happens as we start to attune to all the resource that comes with our interdependence as well. So, you know, and like, I feel deeply inspired that people like Martin Luther King, also, they pointed to this recognition of our interwovenness, you know. So he said somewhere in a real sense, all life is interrelated, that we're all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. So there's a deep ask here, and I really think the Buddha is really pointing to this. He's like, you know, when he says our mind is afflicted, he says we can't see what is for our own welfare, the welfare of others, or both. It's like really simple. It's like, so when our mind is in a place of wisdom, openness, awakeness, connectedness, we start to look not just for what is for our own well-being, release of suffering, but what is for the welfare of the whole, which may sometimes imply questioning our own interests and also structural imbalances, structural in oppression that is happening, actually. So Bhikkhu Bodhi, who, as you know, it's like I'm a very large fan of, he says we have, even in Buddhist practice, we have a tendency in the West to pick up practice in a kind of a very personal, individualized or atomized way. So like my suffering, my release from suffering, which he says, and I really have this sense too. I feel really grateful that he's named it. He says that when we do this, we actually really limit practice, both in terms of its benefit in the world and even in terms of its benefit for ourselves, because we're ultimately not separate. That when we have insight into interdependence, when we have insight into our deep nature, we start to really sense we are not so separate. And so this heart, which can be awake, how can it start to respond in a way that is really for the welfare of the whole and the alleviation of the suffering within the whole? And this is to do with a sense of honesty, actually, internally. So we can start, of course, we practice within ourselves, and we practice to recognize our awakeness, to recognize resource that helps to hold our own habits that are harmful for our own being. But it's almost for me, as we start to attune to that very deep resource, we recognize this being, the resource is part of a whole, this being is part of a whole, and so the vision gets larger of what liberation may be into the collective. And so Bhikkhu Bodhi, when he talks about this, he says it very, very succinctly, so I'm going to quote him. He says, to see into the interconnectedness of all living things is to see how all living things are part of a unified field that contain all. And at the same time to see that this entire field is embodied by each being, constituted of its cells, organs, nervous system, and consciousness. And then this is really important. Correct cognition entails appropriate action. It issues an ethic that bids us to consider the long-term effects our deeds exert on other people, on all beings endowed with sentience, and on the entire biosphere. So we have correct cognition, we have right view, and from this, right action ensues in terms of its consideration for our collective well-being and liberation. So this is a real place of transformation, and it's very much needed right now, as we know. And yeah, so there's this encouragement to look clearly and to respond from this awareness in a way that is both aware of how we cause suffering for ourselves and how we relate in this world that does or does not add to the suffering of others. And while I'm on Bhikkhu Bodhi, I want to read you another quote of his on conscientious compassion, which I think is really powerful and is really powerful in our spiritual circles right now, where there can be a tendency to separate spirituality and how we are in the world. And so Bhikkhu Bodhi at this time, actually for many years, this is a bit of a sadness, like he wrote this article, The Need of the Hour, in like 2010. It's like 2026 now. So The Need of the Hour. Now, you're going to have to bear with me because the screen might jump a bit, but he says, in my understanding, the crisis of our age requires that wisdom and compassion jointly acquire an immanent transformative function that can give a new direction to our collective life. The key to this transformation is what I call conscientious compassion. This is a compassion that does not confine itself to passively wishing good for others, but courageously takes the steps necessary to help them, to remove their suffering and to bring them real happiness. This is a compassion informed by the voice of conscience, which continually reminds us that too many of our fellow beings, human and animal alike, are unjustly condemned to lives of misery. Conscientious compassion boldly enters the fray of action, not afraid to engage with politics, economics, and programs of social uplift. It tells us we need to treat people as ends rather than means, ensuring that they are protected against exploitation and injustice. It is at once a compassion that acts and a sense of conscience that remains ever open to the pain of the world. So, Sadhu Bhikkhu Bodhi. Yeah, so this is a deep call to our wisdom, a deep call to our wisdom capacity. And it's asking us to, like for many of us, it's asking us to really come down from like our ways of experiencing the world. It's asking us to come into a very different relationship with the world, with the sense of our practice. And I think this is both really important for our own freedom, and for it goes together with upholding this kind of care in the world, like engaged care in the world. So there's a way in which the wisdom capacity asks for me, for us to be looking truthfully and clearly at our impermanence, at our vulnerability, and at our interdependence. There's a way in which this wisdom capacity is asking us to look with discernment at this world, so to turn our attention to the places that are painful, also to turn our attention when we need resource, and to turn our attention to that which is difficult, to that which isn't necessarily represented in the mainstream media. So our friend Lubna was just part of a really good conference with the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. Oh, sorry, Sarah. Okay, gotcha. Right, I'll lean forward again. She was part of a really good conference with the Buddhist Peace Fellowship, and she was pointing out how since the so-called ceasefire in Gaza, the people in Gaza are saying it's now the invisible genocide. So through stopping food, through stopping supplies, there's still attacks happening, people are dying of cold, and none of this is being represented in mainstream media. And she was saying one of the things we can do in the Buddhist world is to turn attention, to look at it, to bring it through. So there's something about using our capacity for discernment to see what is not being represented and to turn our attention there and to uphold it. There's something about using our discernment to discern what we are being fed with in the news, discern through that. Thank you, Jilna, that's great. So Jilna's just put a link from Lubna in the chat. And to use our reflective capacity. So I was very struck by a comment by Hannah Arendt years and years ago, where she said when we're being fed lots of misinformation, often the kind of aim of that is not so we believe the misinformation, but so that we don't know what to believe anymore, and we don't know how to reflect anymore. So we need to really be using our capacity to reflect. This also comes from our wisdom capacity. There's the wisdom capacity then to discern, are we fostering greed, hatred, and delusion, to look deeply within in ourselves and the systems we're part of. And then there's this other possibility also within wisdom, where which I also really love as a capacity, which is to go beyond our habitual ways of knowing. So there's something about the way that we've learned about how we know. We know through our intellect, we know this way, we know that way. And the wisdom capacity, actually, one of the ways of translating it is prajna from the Sanskrit, which is before knowing. It's like this place of less, how to say it, where there's much more fruitfulness within us. There's much more capacity to feel, to discern, to know in different ways than we've been habituated to. And I think this is a really important part of our deepening also, because I think in our current world, the ways in which our attention is formed, our awareness is formed, it's become very speedy, it's become quite grasping, it doesn't have patience, a lot of patience for the feeling senses, the more connected senses, a different sense of being. There is an invitation in the spiritual path also. So this wisdom capacity is also asking us to slow down and deepen in the ways of not knowing, where a more fruitful response can actually come through. And the quote that I read from, that I put in the send out from Bayo Kamalafi speaks to this. So I'll read that out for anybody who didn't get the send out. So he says, the emergence of wisdom lies not in the accumulation of truth or the mastery of facts, but as an eruptive, relational, and excessive practice that dwells within the fissures of certainty. So this is the invitation into the places that we don't know, and we don't know how to respond. It's the invitation to settle there, to listen more deeply, and I would say to start to feel into our ways of knowing that are less habitual, and that can't be named, actually, so I'm not going to do a whole list of them here. But there's something about our depth, our capacity to attune to depth. This touches for me the ways of knowing of our interdependence, the way that we know that we're awake, the way that we can allow that awakeness to shape and form our responses in the world. So this is also actually part of the wisdom capacity, and it is relational. It's like it doesn't have to shy away from experience. So sometimes the teachings on unknowing, it gets turned into, or it can become, well, I can't really know anything and I don't want to grasp anything, so I can't take a position. And actually, there's something way more slippery about it than that. It's like we're continually, actually, however we're manifesting in the world, even if we say we're not taking a position, we're taking a position, right? So there's something about the invitation into this meeting of form and emptiness, where we both have incredible capacity to flow, to listen, to be responsive, and to also hold something, as this feels to be what is of value at this time, what is for the well-being of the whole, and to really keep holding that, to actually keep learning in it, keep responsive. Difficult to pin down, but there's something about that invitation too that is also very present in this invitation into wisdom. So, yes, it's a big topic, but I hope that I've given some sense of the different areas that it can take us into. So maybe I'll just summarize again the main areas that I feel are important. So the capacity to discern more deeply, more truthfully our being. So in our interdependence and in our capacity for awakeness, and how these two things together can be very, very powerful in terms of an invitation to relate differently in this world. So the clear discernment also of how in that relationship we may be adding to greed, hatred, or delusion within our own being or within the world that we're part of. This discernment capacity also asks us to look clearly into the world that we're part of. What is happening? Where might our being be able to intervene and relate differently, help something to relate differently for our collective liberation? And also this capacity for knowing differently. So the before knowing, so returning things to the womb of awareness and seeing what arises from there. And as we start to practice in these ways, it's both we have both an incredible resource and also a certain accountability. So, you know, I had a bit of a thing recently where I said I was in New Mexico, and I can see some people who were there at that time when I broke my wrist. And and I said this thing, and I was like, so, you know, we have a very deep well within us. And it's like, and if we're going to drink from that well, then we have a certain responsibility, you know, to keep honoring it, you know, in our actions of body, speech, and mind. And then this whole series of life events happened where it was like, well, okay, if I'm going to say something like that, it's going to hold me accountable, you know. So I broke my wrist, and then a whole series of life events, a cumula kind of rolled down on top to make sure I was holding my alignment. So yeah, So, but I really feel it's true, actually, that we have this deep well of awakeness and we have this deep interconnectedness. And when we start to listen into that, there's a huge resource. And there is a certain, we need to keep honoring it, keep honoring it. And I think our wisdom helps us to do that. And it's much needed in this world. So, yeah, I'll end here, and I hope there were some things in there that were helpful, and if not, please just let them go. Yes, before people leave, I'm just going to put the links in the chat for upcoming events